As Mrs. Edith Thompson watched the Johnsons move in from her living room window, her lips pressed into a thin line. She clutched her pearls, her mind buzzing with disapproval. A black family in Maplewood? And not just any family. A police chief? To her, this represented more than just a new neighbor. It was a shift, a disruption to the neighborhood she had called home for nearly 4 decades. For days, Mrs. Thompson kept to herself, observing the Johnsons from a distance as they settled into their new home. She noticed how they worked diligently, fixing up the yard, greeting neighbors with warm smiles, and making every effort to integrate into the community. But no matter what they did, in Mrs. Thompson's eyes, they didn't belong. Then came the invitation. One sunny Saturday afternoon, brightly colored flyers appeared in every mailbox along Birchwood Lane, inviting the residents to a welcome barbecue at the Johnsons' home. The invitation was cheerful, promising good food, music, and an opportunity to meet the newcomers. Most of the neighbors were excited, intrigued by the idea of getting to know the family. But Mrs. Thompson crumpled the flyer in her fist. A barbecue? In Maplewood? She couldn't stand the thought of it. The day of the barbecue arrived, and the Johnsons' backyard was buzzing with activity. Neighbors filled the space, plates piled high with ribs, burgers, and Angela's famous potato salad. Children played, while adults mingled, chatting and laughing. Michael stood by the grill, flipping burgers and engaging in friendly conversation with those who had come to welcome his family. But not everyone was enjoying the festivities. From her window, Mrs. Thompson watched the scene unfold, her irritation growing with each burst of laughter that floated over to her home. She couldn't bear it anymore. Grabbing her phone, she dialed 911. "There's a disturbance at 25 Birchwood Lane," she said sharply. "A large gathering. Loud music. I don't feel safe." It wasn't long before the sound of police sirens pierced the cheerful atmosphere of the barbecue. The neighbors turned their heads, confused, as 2 patrol cars pulled up in front of the Johnsons' home. Michael's brow furrowed as he saw the officers approach, his instincts kicking in. "What's going on here?" one of the officers asked, his hand hovering near his belt. Before anyone could respond, Mrs. Thompson emerged from her home, her face red with self-righteous indignation. "I called," she announced loudly. "This is a quiet neighborhood, and this," she gestured wildly at the gathering, "this is unacceptable." The crowd fell silent, all eyes on the officers and Mrs. Thompson. Michael stepped forward, calm but firm. "Officer, I'm Michael Johnson," he said, extending a hand. "I'm the new police chief." The officers froze, recognition dawning on their faces. They had met him just days ago at the station. Embarrassment flickered in their eyes as they realized the situation. "Chief Johnson," one of them said, "we had no idea this was your home. We received a complaint about a disturbance." Michael glanced at Mrs. Thompson, his jaw tight. "A disturbance?" he echoed. "We're having a barbecue, a welcome barbecue for our neighbors." The officers shifted uncomfortably, clearly aware they were in the middle of something far bigger than a noise complaint. "It seems like everything is under control here," one finally said, avoiding eye contact with Mrs. Thompson. "We'll be on our way." As the patrol cars pulled away, the neighborhood was left in stunned silence. Mrs. Thompson, too flustered to speak, huffed and retreated to her home, slamming the door behind her. The mood of the barbecue had shifted, but Michael, with a deep breath, smiled at his guests. "All right," he said. "Who wants more ribs?" The tension slowly melted away as the neighbors resumed their conversations, but something had changed. The Johnsons had seen firsthand the undercurrent of prejudice that still existed, but they had also witnessed the solidarity of their new neighbors. People who, despite Mrs. Thompson's actions, had chosen to welcome them. As the sun set on Maplewood that evening, the neighborhood was left with more than just the memory of a barbecue. It was a moment of reckoning, an undeniable reminder that even in the most seemingly perfect places, change is inevitable, and sometimes it takes just one brave family to expose what lies beneath the surface. As Michael returned to his house, that edge in Mrs. Thompson's demeanor lingered in his mind. She had been polite enough, but there was an unmistakable coldness in the way she spoke, a subtle message that they weren't truly welcome. He shared his feelings with Angela later that evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky with soft shades of orange and pink. "I don't know, Ange," Michael said, his brow furrowed. "There's something about her. It's like she's just waiting for us to mess up or prove we don't belong here." Angela nodded slowly, feeling a similar unease since their brief encounter in the garden. "I felt it too. She's polite, but it's more like she's checking a box. There's no warmth, no real interest in us. Just judgment." They both sat in silence for a moment, the quiet hum of the neighborhood around them. The Johnsons were used to being in spaces where they were different, where people didn't know what to make of them. But Maplewood had felt like a fresh start, a new chapter in their lives. Michael's role as police chief added another layer of complexity. He wasn't just any resident. He was a leader in the community. And yet it seemed that for some, that wasn't enough. "I guess we'll have to win her over," Angela finally said, her voice filled with resolve. "We've faced tougher challenges than an icy neighbor." Michael smiled at his wife's optimism. "You're right. We've got a beautiful home, good jobs, and great kids. If she can't see that, it's her loss." But as the days passed, the feeling that they were being watched and judged persisted. Whenever the Johnsons were outside, whether tending the garden, playing with the kids, or simply enjoying a quiet moment on the porch, Michael would catch glimpses of Mrs. Thompson, watching from her window. She never lingered for long, but her presence was always there, like a specter of disapproval hanging over them. The final straw came when the Johnsons planned their welcome barbecue. Angela had insisted that it would be a great way to meet more of the neighbors and maybe even break through Mrs. Thompson's chilly exterior. They'd sent out invites to every house on Birchwood Lane, including Mrs. Thompson's. Angela had personally slipped the invitation into her mailbox, hoping that a gesture of goodwill might thaw the icy tension between them. The day of the barbecue arrived, and the Johnsons had gone all out. Delicious food, music, games for the kids, and even a little something for the adults. Neighbors began to trickle in, chatting and laughing as they filled their plates with ribs, burgers, and Angela's famous mac and cheese. Jasmine and Kevin ran around with the other children, their laughter filling the air. But Mrs. Thompson hadn't shown up. Angela tried not to let it bother her, focusing on making everyone else feel welcome. The party was going well, and most of the neighbors seemed to be enjoying themselves, but there was still that feeling. The subtle looks, the whispered conversations, that reminded the Johnsons they were being carefully scrutinized. As the barbecue continued, Michael noticed Mrs. Thompson across the street, standing on her porch, watching them. He waved, trying once again to extend an olive branch, but she didn't return the gesture. Instead, she turned and disappeared inside her house. Minutes later, the sound of sirens echoed down the street, and 2 police cars pulled up in front of the Johnsons' home. Angela's heart sank as the officers stepped out of their vehicles, their hands resting near their belts, eyes scanning the gathering. Michael walked over to greet them, his face a mask of calm, but inside, he was seething. He knew what this was. He had seen it happen to others, and now it was happening to his family. "Officers," he said, keeping his tone steady, "what seems to be the problem?" One of the officers, recognizing him, looked visibly uncomfortable. "Chief Johnson, we received a call about a disturbance. Large gathering, loud music." The caller said they felt unsafe. Michael's eyes narrowed. He glanced around at the barbecue. Families chatting, kids playing, music at a reasonable volume. There was nothing remotely threatening about it. "I see," Michael said, his voice tight. "Well, as you can see, we're just having a barbecue. Nothing out of the ordinary." The officers exchanged uneasy glances before one of them finally nodded. "It looks like everything's fine here, Chief. We'll head out." As they left, the tension at the barbecue had become palpable. The neighbors who had been enjoying themselves just moments before were now awkwardly silent, avoiding eye contact with the Johnsons. The mood had shifted. Angela, feeling the weight of the moment, stood by Michael's side, her hand resting gently on his arm. "I guess we know who made that call," she said quietly. Michael nodded, his gaze fixed on Mrs. Thompson's house. He didn't say anything, but the message was clear. This was no simple misunderstanding. It was a deliberate attempt to remind them that in some eyes they still didn't belong. But as the barbecue slowly resumed, Michael and Angela knew that this was just the beginning of their journey in Maplewood. They weren't going anywhere. And if Mrs. Thompson thought she could scare them away, she was about to learn just how wrong she was. Like we're always going to be outsiders, Angela finished, her voice tinged with a quiet frustration. Michael reached out and took her hand, squeezing it gently. I feel it too, he admitted, his voice low. But we can't let that define our experience here. We're part of this community now, whether they like it or not. Angela sighed, leaning her head on Michael's shoulder as they both stared out at the quiet street. The homes, with their manicured lawns and neat driveways, looked peaceful and serene. But beneath the surface, an invisible wall separated the Johnsons from many of their neighbors. It's just exhausting, Angela continued. Always having to prove ourselves, always being the ones to reach out and try to bridge the gap. I know, Michael said softly, but change takes time. We've dealt with this before. It's nothing new. Jasmine, who had been listening quietly from the doorway, chimed in. Maybe we don't need everyone to like us. Maybe it's enough if we just focus on the people who do. There are some nice neighbors, right? Angela smiled at her daughter's optimism. You're right, Jazz. There are good people here too. We just need to keep building those connections. The Johnsons had noticed a few families who had made an effort to welcome them. Friendly nods, invitations for coffee, small acts of kindness that stood in stark contrast to the coldness of others like Mrs. Thompson. Those connections, though small, gave them hope that things could get better. Still, Michael added, we can't ignore the fact that there's a problem. It's not just about being new. There's something more going on. Angela nodded, her thoughts drifting back to the subtle comments, the whispers, the way Mrs. Thompson had looked at them from day one. You think it's because we're black? Michael didn't hesitate. I know it is. I've seen this before. People like Mrs. Thompson, they don't want to see their world change. They see us as a threat, as if by being here, we're somehow taking something away from them. Angela sighed again, the weight of Michael's words settling heavily in the air. It's so frustrating. We work hard, we're good people, and yet some will never see that. Michael squeezed her hand again. We'll just keep being who we are. People will come around, or they won't. But either way, we're not going anywhere. They sat in silence for a moment, the sounds of the neighborhood fading into the background. Despite the challenges, the Johnsons had no intention of giving up. This was their home now, and they were determined to create a life here, no matter what obstacles they faced. As the evening deepened, Angela stood up and stretched. We'll take it one day at a time, she said, her voice steady with newfound resolve. And we'll keep showing them who we really are. Michael smiled, proud of his wife's strength. Exactly. We've come too far to let anyone push us out. Jasmine grinned, her youthful optimism a bright light in the midst of the tension. Besides, maybe Mrs. Thompson will come around one day. Stranger things have happened, right? Angela chuckled. We can hope. As they headed inside, ready to settle in for the night, there was a sense of unity among them. The challenges they faced were real, but so was their determination to make Maplewood their home. A home where they belonged, whether their neighbors accepted it or not. Michael smiled at the enthusiasm from his kids, glad to see their excitement. That sounds like a great idea, he said, meeting Angela's gaze. It could be a good chance to break the ice with some of the neighbors, especially Mrs. Thompson. Maybe if she sees us as more than just the new family, it might soften her up. Angela nodded, encouraged by his support. Exactly. We've had a few good interactions with some of the neighbors, but this could really bring people together, show them who we are. They spent the next few days planning the barbecue, making sure everything would be perfect. Angela prepared a menu of delicious foods. Grilled ribs, burgers, her famous potato salad, and a variety of side dishes. Michael arranged for some music and games for the kids, while Jasmine and Kevin helped spread the word by handing out invitations to all the neighbors, including Mrs. Thompson. The day of the barbecue arrived, and the Johnsons were up early, setting up tables, arranging chairs, and firing up the grill. By midday, the smell of sizzling meat wafted through the air, and neighbors began to trickle in, some bringing homemade dishes to share. The backyard filled with the sounds of laughter, conversation, and children playing. The atmosphere was warm and welcoming, just as Angela had envisioned. Despite the growing crowd, Angela kept glancing toward Mrs. Thompson's house, wondering if she would show. As the afternoon wore on, she began to lose hope. But just as she was serving another plate of food, she saw Mrs. Thompson walking down the street, Buttons trotting at her side. Angela quickly wiped her hands on a towel and made her way over. "Mrs. Thompson," she called out, waving. "I'm so glad you could make it." Mrs. Thompson paused, her face as unreadable as ever. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Johnson," she said stiffly. "I thought I would stop by for a moment. It seems you've attracted quite the crowd." Angela smiled, refusing to be dissuaded by the older woman's tone. "We've had a wonderful turnout. Please come in and help yourself to some food. We got plenty." Mrs. Thompson hesitated, her eyes sweeping over the gathering. It was clear she wasn't entirely comfortable being there, but after a moment, she nodded and followed Angela into the yard. As the afternoon progressed, Mrs. Thompson kept to herself, sitting quietly in a corner of the yard with Buttons at her feet. She didn't interact much with the other neighbors, but she didn't leave either. Michael made a point of checking on her, bringing her a plate of food and sitting down for a brief chat. Though her responses were brief and guarded, there was a slight softening in her demeanor, just enough for Michael to notice. By the end of the day, the barbecue had been a resounding success. The Johnsons had managed to connect with more of their neighbors, and even though Mrs. Thompson remained an enigma, there was a sense of progress. As she finally got up to leave, Angela walked her to the gate. "Thank you for coming, Mrs. Thompson," Angela said sincerely. "We hope you enjoyed yourself." Mrs. Thompson gave a small, curt nod. "It was fine," she replied. "Thank you for the invitation." She paused, her eyes narrowing slightly as she looked at Angela. "Your family is different from what I'm used to, but I suppose everyone has to adjust to change sooner or later." Angela smiled, not entirely sure whether that was a compliment or not, but choosing to take it as one. "Change can be good," she said, echoing her earlier sentiment from their first conversation. Mrs. Thompson didn't respond, but as she turned and walked away, there was a faint sense that perhaps, just maybe, things were beginning to shift. That evening, as the Johnsons cleaned up from the barbecue, Angela felt a renewed sense of hope. "I think it went well," she said, her voice light with relief. Even Mrs. Thompson seemed to, I don't know, thaw a little. Michael nodded, pulling her into a hug. "We're making progress, Ange. It might take time, but we'll get there." Jasmine grinned, her eyes bright. "See? I told you people can change. Maybe she'll even be nice next time." Angela laughed, ruffling her daughter's hair. "We'll see, Jazz. We'll see." As the family finished cleaning up and settled in for the night, they knew there would still be challenges ahead. But after that day, they also knew that they weren't outsiders. They were part of the community, and little by little, they were making Maplewood their home. Back at home, Angela tried to shake off the discomfort from their interaction with Mrs. Thompson. She didn't want to let one cold reception ruin the excitement of the barbecue, especially with Jasmine so eager to host. As they stepped inside, Michael looked up from the grill prep, noticing the shift in Angela's expression. "How did it go with Mrs. Thompson?" he asked, wiping his hands on a towel. Angela forced a smile. "It went about as well as I expected." She took the invitation, but didn't seem too keen on the idea. And she made a comment to Jasmine. Children should be seen and not heard. It wasn't exactly warm. Michael sighed, shaking his head. "I figured as much. She's made it clear she's not interested in getting to know us. But at least we tried, right?" Jasmine, still holding on to a bit of hope, looked up at her parents. "Maybe she'll change her mind. Maybe if she sees how fun it is, she'll come." Angela leaned down, giving Jasmine a reassuring hug. "That's the spirit, sweetie. We'll just have to wait and see." As the day of the barbecue arrived, the Johnsons put the final touches on the preparations. The backyard was transformed into a welcoming space, with tables full of food, lawn games set up for the kids, and a mix of upbeat music playing softly in the background. The smell of grilled burgers and ribs filled the air, and the first neighbors started to trickle in, their curiosity piqued by the festive atmosphere. Angela and Michael made sure to greet everyone personally, offering plates of food and engaging in easy conversation. Jasmine, playing the perfect hostess, introduced herself to the other children, leading them to the games set up in the yard. Kevin, though a bit more reserved, found his way into a group of boys playing with a soccer ball. As the afternoon progressed, the backyard began to fill up. Some of the more hesitant neighbors started to relax, chatting with one another and enjoying the food. The kids played happily, and the atmosphere was warm and lively. But despite the success of the event, Angela couldn't help but glance toward Mrs. Thompson's house every now and then. The older woman hadn't shown up, and though Angela hadn't really expected her to, she still felt a small pang of disappointment. Just as she was about to give up hope, she noticed movement near Mrs. Thompson's house. There, standing on the porch with Buttons at her side, was Mrs. Thompson. She wasn't coming over, but she was watching the barbecue from a distance, her expression unreadable. Angela nudged Michael, nodding toward the porch. "Look," she whispered. Michael glanced over and saw Mrs. Thompson as well. "At least she's watching," he said softly. "Maybe she's curious." Angela smiled, hopeful. "Maybe," she agreed. The barbecue continued well into the evening, with neighbors lingering longer than expected, laughing and enjoying the company. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the yard, Angela felt a sense of accomplishment. Despite the rocky start, they had succeeded in creating a welcoming event that had brought people together. By the time the last guests had left and the Johnsons began cleaning up, there was a sense of optimism in the air. While Mrs. Thompson had remained distant, the Johnsons knew they had made strides in connecting with the rest of the neighborhood. As they gathered on the porch later that night, tired but happy, Jasmine spoke up. "Even if Mrs. Thompson didn't come, I think it was a really good day." Angela smiled at her daughter, her heart swelling with pride. "It was a great day, Jazz. And who knows? Maybe next time Mrs. Thompson will surprise us." Michael leaned back in his chair, a satisfied look on his face. "We've made a start, and that's all that matters." As they sat there, watching the stars begin to twinkle in the night sky, the Johnsons knew they were on the right path. Maplewood might still have its challenges, but they were determined to keep building their life there, one connection at a time. Mrs. Thompson paced back and forth in her living room, her frustration mounting with each laugh and clink of a drink she heard from across the street. The vibrant, diverse energy of the Johnsons' barbecue felt like a direct challenge to the world she had spent decades protecting, a world she believed was slipping away. From her vantage point, she watched as more neighbors trickled into the Johnsons' backyard, warmly welcomed by Michael and Angela. They looked so comfortable, so natural, as if they belonged. And maybe to many of the neighbors they did, but to Mrs. Thompson, it felt like a betrayal. She had done her part. She had sown the seeds of doubt, whispering her concerns into the ears of those who would listen. And while some neighbors had heeded her warnings and stayed away, clearly, not enough had. The sight of families, asterisk or asterisk neighbors, laughing with the Johnsons only intensified her feeling of losing control. In the backyard, Angela moved between guests, offering more food and checking in to see if everyone was comfortable. She noticed Mrs. Thompson's absence but pushed the thought aside, focusing on the good things, the conversations, the smiles, and the laughter filling their yard. Jasmine and Kevin were playing with the other children, their joy infectious, while Michael manned the grill, chatting easily with the men who had come. But despite the warm atmosphere, Angela couldn't help but feel a subtle tension. She was aware of the absences, the neighbors who had declined or ignored their invitation altogether. She knew some of it was because of Mrs. Thompson's influence, and though it hurt, she reminded herself that not everyone could be won over. Not yet anyway. As the afternoon wore on, the party showed no signs of slowing down. Guests mingled, children played, and the Johnsons' home was filled with the kind of lively energy Angela had always hoped for. Yet across the street, Mrs. Thompson's resentment grew. In her mind, this was no simple neighborhood barbecue. It was a harbinger of change she had long feared. Finally, unable to take it any longer, Mrs. Thompson grabbed her coat and decided to go for a walk. Buttons trotted along beside her as she made her way down the street, deliberately avoiding the Johnsons' house. She didn't want to acknowledge the scene unfolding just a few steps from her door. As she passed by other homes, she caught sight of a few neighbors who hadn't gone to the barbecue, chatting among themselves or working in their yards. Some greeted her with a wave, which she returned with a tight smile. Others, however, seemed to be heading toward the Johnsons' house, making her grip Button's leash tighter. Meanwhile, back at the barbecue, Michael noticed Angela's slight frown as she looked toward the street. "You okay?" he asked, stepping away from the grill and placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Angela sighed, glancing around at the gathering crowd and then at the few houses that had remained dark and quiet. "I am. It's just, I can't stop thinking about the people who didn't come. Mrs. Thompson has more influence than I realized." Michael nodded, understanding her disappointment. "We knew not everyone would be on board right away. But look at the people who did come. They're having a great time. We're building connections one step at a time. That's what matters." Angela smiled, grateful for Michael's unwavering positivity. "You're right. We can't win everyone over, but we're making progress. That's enough for now." As the barbecue continued, the Johnsons reveled in the success of the day. Despite the absences and the underlying tensions, the event had achieved its purpose. It had brought together a diverse group of neighbors who, for the most part, seemed happy to welcome them into the fold. That evening, as they sat down together to unwind after the event, Jasmine piped up with her characteristic optimism. "Maybe next time more people will come, and maybe Mrs. Thompson will come too." Angela smiled at her daughter's innocence. "Maybe," she said softly. "But even if she doesn't, we've already shown we belong here." Michael nodded in agreement. "And we're not going anywhere." Across the street, Mrs. Thompson returned from her walk, her mood no better than when she had left. As she entered her quiet, orderly house, she looked out the window one last time at the Johnsons' backyard, now mostly empty, with just the family sitting together, talking and laughing. She turned away, her heart heavy with resentment, convinced that Maplewood, Maplewood, was changing, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. But the Johnsons, now more determined than ever, had already become part of that change, and they weren't going to let anyone, not even Mrs. Thompson, stand in their way. On the Johnsons' backyard, waiting for the moment she believed would bring her vindication, Mrs. Thompson's heart raced with anticipation, her mind swirling with a mixture of resentment and self-righteousness. She had convinced herself that this was the only way to restore order in Maplewood, to protect her precious neighborhood from the perceived threat the Johnsons represented. Across the street, the Johnsons were oblivious to the storm that was about to hit. They were still basking in the success of the day, unaware of the darkness brewing just beyond their fence. Guests had started to leave, thanking Michael and Angela for their hospitality. The family was in good spirits, their worries about being accepted temporarily eased by the warmth and camaraderie of those who had shown up. As the last of the guests waved goodbye and disappeared down the street, Michael began tidying up the yard. Angela gathered up plates and cups while Jasmine and Kevin helped with smaller tasks, their excitement from the day still evident on their faces. Just as they were finishing the cleanup, the distant wail of police sirens reached their ears. Angela's brow furrowed as she looked up, her hands still holding a stack of dishes. "Do you hear that?" Michael paused, listening. "Yes, sounds like police. But it can't be for us, right?" The sirens grew louder, and before long, 2 police cruisers pulled up in front of the Johnsons' house, their lights flashing in the dim evening light. The sudden appearance of the police caught everyone off guard, and a few remaining neighbors still lingering in the street exchanged puzzled glances. Michael, his instincts as a police chief kicking in, wiped his hands on his apron and approached the officers as they stepped out of their vehicles. His expression was calm, though a knot of tension had formed in his stomach. He couldn't help but wonder what had prompted this unexpected visit. "Good evening, officers," Michael greeted them, his voice measured. "Is there a problem?" One of the officers, a tall man with a clipboard in hand, glanced at Michael before looking around the yard. "We received a noise complaint from a neighbor," he said, his tone professional but cautious. "They mentioned possible suspicious behavior and excessive noise." Michael's jaw tightened slightly, but he remained composed. He knew what this was. "We've been hosting a neighborhood barbecue," he explained, gesturing toward the tables and grill. "It's winding down now, as you can see. I can assure you there's nothing suspicious happening here." The second officer, a younger woman, nodded but seemed uncomfortable. "We just have to check things out, sir. Do you mind if we take a look around?" Michael nodded, though he couldn't shake the feeling of frustration simmering beneath his calm exterior. "Of course. You're welcome to take a look." As the officers walked around the backyard, speaking briefly to Angela and checking the area, Mrs. Thompson watched from her window, her heart pounding with anticipation. She fully expected the police to shut down the Johnsons' gathering, to restore the peace and quiet she believed had been disrupted. But as the minutes ticked by, her sense of satisfaction began to falter. Back in the yard, the officers quickly realized there was no disturbance, no illegal activity, nothing remotely out of the ordinary. The barbecue had been just that, a family-friendly event in a suburban neighborhood. After a few more routine questions, they apologized for the disruption. "Sorry to bother you," the first officer said to Michael, clearly recognizing that this was nothing more than a misunderstanding. "Looks like everything's fine here. We'll head out." Michael, though outwardly composed, felt a wave of irritation as he watched the officers leave. He knew exactly who had made that call, and while it wasn't surprising, it still stung. After all their efforts to be a part of the community, this was the response they got. Someone trying to push them out, to make them feel unwelcome. Angela joined him as he stood at the edge of the yard, watching the cruisers drive away. "Mrs. Thompson," she said quietly, her voice tinged with both frustration and sadness. "It had to be her." Michael nodded. "Yeah, it was, but we didn't do anything wrong, Ange. We're not going to let her win." Angela took a deep breath, trying to steady her emotions. "I know, but it just hurts, you know? After all that work, after trying so hard to be a part of this place." Michael wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close. "We're not going anywhere. Let her think what she wants. We belong here, and we'll keep showing that to everyone else." Across the street, Mrs. Thompson watched the police cars leave, her face pale with disbelief. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. The police were supposed to put an end to the barbecue, to see the Johnsons as the intruders she knew they were. But instead, they had left, having found nothing wrong. As she stared out at the Johnsons, standing together in their yard, united and unbroken, Mrs. Thompson felt an unfamiliar pang in her chest, something that might have been doubt, or perhaps even guilt. But she quickly shoved it down, unwilling to admit that she might have been wrong. For the Johnsons, the night ended on a bittersweet note. They had successfully hosted their barbecue, made new friends, and solidified their place in the neighborhood. But they also knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Mrs. Thompson's call to the police had been a reminder that not everyone was ready to accept them. Still, as they stood together under the fading light of the evening, they knew one thing for certain. They weren't going to let one bitter neighbor drive them away. They had found their home, and they were there to stay. Mrs. Thompson returned to her post by the window, her eyes fixated on the Johnsons' backyard, eagerly awaiting the arrival of the police. In her mind, she envisioned the scene unfolding exactly as she hoped. Flashing lights, stern officers, and a swift end to the disturbance that had dared to disrupt the quiet order of Maplewood. She could already picture the Johnsons' shocked faces as the authorities put them in their place. Meanwhile, the Johnsons remained blissfully unaware of the turmoil brewing across the street. The evening had gone so smoothly, better than either Michael or Angela had anticipated. As they began to wind down, more neighbors were saying their goodbyes, and the atmosphere was one of warmth and connection. Michael had just poured himself a glass of lemonade when he heard it, the unmistakable sound of approaching sirens. Angela turned toward him, her face a mixture of surprise and concern. "Michael, do you hear that?" He nodded slowly, setting his glass down. The noise grew louder, and within moments, 2 police cars pulled up in front of the house, their flashing lights casting an eerie glow over the quiet street. Jasmine and Kevin, sensing the shift in the air, stood still, their eyes wide with confusion. "Dad? What's happening?" Kevin asked, his voice small and uncertain. Michael, always calm under pressure, glanced at Angela before making his way toward the front of the house. "Stay here with your mom," he instructed the kids. He exchanged a quick look with Angela, who nodded reassuringly, though she couldn't shake the sense of dread creeping into her stomach. As Michael reached the front yard, the officers had already stepped out of their vehicles, their faces neutral but professional. He approached them, keeping his posture relaxed, though inside he was bracing for the worst. "Good evening, officers," Michael said, his tone respectful but firm. "Is there a problem?" The first officer, a tall man with a clipboard in hand, glanced at Michael and then surveyed the scene behind him. "We received a call from a neighbor about a noise complaint and possible suspicious activity," he explained. His voice was even, but there was a hint of discomfort as he realized who he was speaking to. "Just routine. We need to check things out." Michael knew exactly what this was. His years of experience as a police officer had prepared him for moments like this, though he never thought he'd be on the receiving end. Keeping his composure, he gestured toward the backyard. "We've been hosting a neighborhood barbecue. It's mostly wrapped up now. You're welcome to take a look, but I can assure you everything is perfectly fine." The second officer, a younger woman who had been silent up until this point, nodded. "We just need to follow up on the complaint. Mind if we take a quick look around?" Michael stepped aside, allowing them access to the backyard. As the officers made their way past him, Michael couldn't help but glance across the street toward Mrs. Thompson's house. Though her curtains were drawn, he knew she was there, watching, waiting for the scene she had orchestrated. Back in the backyard, Angela was doing her best to keep the kids calm, while also trying to maintain her own composure. Some of the remaining guests were whispering among themselves, clearly confused by the sudden police presence. The officers conducted a quick sweep of the yard, exchanging brief words with a few guests and checking for any signs of disturbance. It didn't take long for them to realize that the call had been exaggerated, if not entirely fabricated. After a few minutes, they returned to the front, where Michael waited. "Everything looks fine here," the first officer said, offering a small nod of apology. "It seems like it was a misunderstanding. Sorry to bother you, Chief Johnson." Michael forced a polite smile, though inside he was seething. "No problem, officers. Thanks for doing your job." The officers left without further incident, and as their cars disappeared down the street, the tension in the air began to lift. But the damage had been done. The remaining neighbors, sensing the awkwardness of the situation, began to leave one by one, offering quiet goodbyes and sympathetic looks. Angela joined Michael at the front, her expression a mix of frustration and hurt. "It was Mrs. Thompson, wasn't it?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Michael nodded grimly. "Yeah, she's trying to scare us off, make us feel like we don't belong." Angela sighed, her shoulders slumping. "We've done everything we could to be part of this community, and this is what we get." Michael wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close. "We're not going anywhere, Ange. Let her play her games. We're stronger than that." Jasmine, who had overheard the conversation, looked up at her parents with wide eyes. "Why doesn't she like us? We didn't do anything wrong." Angela knelt down beside her daughter, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "Sometimes people don't like what's different from them, sweetie. But that doesn't mean we stop being who we are. We belong here, just like anyone else." Jasmine nodded, though the confusion and hurt lingered in her eyes. As the family stood together, watching the last of the evening fade into night, they knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Mrs. Thompson had made her position clear, and it was likely she wasn't done causing trouble. But the Johnsons were united in their resolve. They had chosen Maplewood as their home, and no amount of hostility was going to drive them away. Across the street, Mrs. Thompson sat in her darkened living room, her satisfaction slowly turning to bitterness. The police had come and gone, and yet the Johnsons were still there, standing firm. Deep down, she knew she had lost this battle, but that didn't mean she would give up. In her mind, the fight for Maplewood had only just begun. Michael stood there for a moment, his arm wrapped protectively around Angela, as the realization sank in. Despite their best efforts to fit in and create a sense of community, there were still people like Mrs. Thompson who would always see them as outsiders. His heart ached, not for himself, but for his children. He had hoped that moving to Maplewood would offer them a fresh start, a safe and welcoming environment. But tonight's incident was a reminder that they were still vulnerable to the prejudices of others. As the police cars drove away, the remaining guests in the backyard exchanged glances, their earlier joviality dampened by the sudden turn of events. One of the neighbors, a woman named Susan who had been friendly throughout the barbecue, approached Angela with a concerned expression. I'm so sorry, Susan said quietly, her voice filled with genuine sympathy. I can't believe someone would do that. We were all having such a nice time. Angela forced a small smile, though the sting of the moment was still fresh. Thank you, Susan. We're trying not to let it ruin the night. But it's hard. Michael, overhearing their conversation, chimed in. We knew coming here might be challenging, but it's disheartening when things like this happen. Susan shook her head, clearly upset by the situation. I don't understand why some people are so stuck in their ways. You're a wonderful family, and we're lucky to have you here. Her words, though kind, couldn't erase the hurt completely. Angela glanced toward their children, who were still playing but had slowed down, clearly aware that something had gone wrong. She wondered how much they understood and how much they would remember from this night. Jasmine wandered over, her face reflecting the same confusion and concern that Angela felt. Mom, Dad, why did the police come? Did we do something wrong? Angela knelt down to her daughter's level, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. No, sweetie, we didn't do anything wrong. Someone just made a mistake, that's all. Jasmine looked up at her mother, her young eyes searching for answers. But why did they think something was wrong? Michael crouched down beside Angela, his voice gentle but firm. Sometimes, people don't understand others who are different from them. They might be scared or upset for no reason. But that doesn't mean we stop being who we are or stop trying to be part of this community. Jasmine nodded slowly, her brow furrowed in thought. Kevin, still clutching his soccer ball, listened quietly from behind her. The rest of the guests, sensing the shift in mood, began to say their goodbyes. Many of them expressed their support, offering words of encouragement before heading out, leaving the Johnsons alone in their backyard. As the last neighbor left, Michael and Angela stood together, watching their children play under the soft glow of the string lights. The night had ended in a way they hadn't expected, and the bitterness of the encounter with the police still hung over them. Angela leaned into Michael, her voice soft. I don't know if I can do this, Michael. I don't know if I'm strong enough to keep fighting these battles. Michael sighed, his own heart heavy. We're in this together, Ange. It won't be easy, but we can't let people like Mrs. Thompson win. We belong here, and we'll keep showing that to everyone, no matter how long it takes. Angela nodded, but she remained quiet, her mind still processing everything that had happened. As they began to clean up, Michael caught a glimpse of Mrs. Thompson's window across the street. He couldn't see her, but he knew she was there, watching, her plan having failed to drive them out. We won't be pushed out of our home, Michael muttered to himself, a renewed sense of determination settling over him. As the Johnsons finished tidying up and headed inside, they knew the days ahead would bring more challenges. But they also knew they were not alone. They had made real connections that night, and no matter how hard Mrs. Thompson or others like her tried to resist change, they couldn't stop it from coming. The Johnsons were here to stay, and they were ready to face whatever came next together. They sat in silence for a while, the night air cool against their skin. The excitement and joy of the day had been dampened by what had happened, and though the support from their neighbors had helped, the reality of the situation was still heavy on their hearts. Michael broke the silence first, his voice low. I thought we'd finally turned a corner tonight. Everything was going so well, and then that. He exhaled, shaking his head. I can't believe someone called the police on us. Angela leaned back in her chair, staring up at the stars. It's not just that they called the police, Michael. It's that they saw us, our family as a problem, as a threat. Her voice trembled slightly with the weight of those words. We've done everything we could to be good neighbors and still... Michael reached out and took her hand. I know, he said softly, but we can't let it break us. Whoever did this wants to make us feel like we don't belong. And if we let them succeed, then they win. Angela squeezed his hand in return, grateful for his strength, though she still felt the sting of the evening. It just hurts, she admitted. I was hoping that maybe this would be the start of something good, that we'd finally be accepted. But it feels like we took 2 steps forward and 1 step back tonight. Michael nodded, understanding her frustration. He felt it too. We're going to face people like Mrs. Thompson, people who want to cling to the past and resist change. But we have allies here, Ange, Mrs. Wilson, Susan, the other neighbors who stayed. They see us for who we really are. Angela nodded, her gaze softening. You're right. And that's what we have to hold on to. The ones who see us, who want us here. They sat in silence again, watching the gentle sway of the trees in the night breeze. The yard was quiet now, but the memories of the evening's laughter and joy still lingered faintly, mixing with the disappointment of the police visit. Eventually, Jasmine and Kevin came outside, rubbing their sleepy eyes. Are you guys okay? Jasmine asked, her voice filled with concern. She had sensed the tension earlier, even if she didn't fully understand it. Michael smiled at his daughter, pulling her close as she climbed into his lap. We're okay, sweetheart, he reassured her. We just had a little bump in the road tonight, but everything is fine now. Kevin joined them, settling into Angela's lap. Can we still have barbecues, even if someone calls the police? He asked innocently. Angela chuckled softly, kissing the top of Kevin's head. Of course we can, Kev. We're not going to let one bad experience stop us from having fun. Michael wrapped his arms around Jasmine and looked at Angela, a sense of calm returning. This is our home, he said firmly. And no matter what happens, we'll keep living our lives the way we want. No one can take that from us. They stayed out there a little longer, the four of them sitting together in the quiet night, finding comfort in each other. Despite the challenges they had faced, they were still standing, still united, and still hopeful for the future. Across the street, Mrs. Thompson continued to watch from her window, her heart heavy with a mixture of anger and fear. She had expected the Johnsons to crumble under the weight of her actions, to retreat, maybe even leave Maplewood altogether. But instead, they had stayed strong, and worse, they had garnered even more support from the community. She knew this battle wasn't over. But as she stood there, watching the Johnsons sitting together, their family unshaken by the night's events, a small, nagging voice in the back of her mind whispered that perhaps, just maybe, she had already lost. Is a place where people should feel safe, welcome, and valued. But it's also clear that there are still tensions, misunderstandings, and fears that need to be acknowledged and addressed. That's why we're here tonight. Not to point fingers, but to have an open conversation about how we can move forward as a community. The room was silent, the weight of Michael's words hanging in the air. Angela, sitting in the front row, watched her husband with pride and concern. She knew how important this moment was, not just for them, but for the entire neighborhood. Michael continued, we all come from different backgrounds, and those differences are part of what makes this community strong. But when we let those differences divide us, we lose the opportunity to truly thrive together. My family and I moved here because we believe in the power of community and we want to be part of building something positive here in Maplewood. He glanced at Mrs. Thompson, who was sitting rigidly in her seat, her face unreadable. We know that change can be difficult, but change is also necessary for growth. I'm here not just as your police chief, but as your neighbor. And as neighbors, we owe it to each other to listen, to learn, and to grow. The room remained quiet for a few moments before a hand went up. It was Mrs. Wilson, the elderly woman who had shown support from the beginning. Michael nodded to her, and she stood to speak. I've lived in this neighborhood for a long time, and I've seen it change over the years, she began, her voice steady but soft. And I believe that change is a good thing. The Johnsons have been nothing but kind and welcoming since they arrived, and it's time we all embrace that. We need to stop being afraid of what's different and start seeing the good in one another. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Encouraged, more hands went up. One by one, neighbors began to speak, some expressing their own fears and reservations, while others shared stories of how they had already seen positive changes since the Johnsons had moved in. Then, after a long pause, Mrs. Thompson slowly stood. The room seemed to collectively hold its breath as she cleared her throat, her eyes downcast. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter, lacking the sharp edge that Michael and Angela had grown accustomed to. I've lived in Maplewood for over 40 years, and in that time, I've seen this neighborhood go through many changes. Some of them have been hard to accept. When the Johnsons moved in, she hesitated, clearly struggling to find the right words. I was scared. I didn't want things to change. I thought if I held on tight enough to the way things were, I could stop it. She looked up at Michael, her expression softer than they had ever seen. But I see now that I was wrong. I let my fear get the better of me, and I made a decision that I'm not proud of. I apologize for what I did. It wasn't right, and I realize that now. There was a moment of stunned silence before Mrs. Wilson, sitting a few rows ahead, spoke up again. It takes a lot of courage to admit when we've made mistakes, she said kindly. We appreciate your honesty, Edith. Mrs. Thompson nodded stiffly, then sat back down, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Michael took a deep breath, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. This was the beginning of something important, something that could change the neighborhood for the better. Thank you, Mrs. Thompson, he said sincerely. It's never easy to confront our own fears, but by doing so, we take the first step toward healing and moving forward together. The rest of the meeting continued with more neighbors sharing their thoughts and experiences. By the end of the night, it was clear that while there was still work to be done, progress had been made. People were talking, listening, and beginning to understand each other in ways they hadn't before. As the meeting came to a close and the neighbors began to disperse, Michael and Angela stood together, feeling a renewed sense of hope. They had faced a difficult challenge, but they had come through it stronger, and they knew they weren't alone. We're going to be okay, Angela said softly, leaning into Michael as they watched the last of the neighbors leave the recreation center. Michael smiled, wrapping his arm around her. Yeah, we are. One step at a time. As time passed, the Johnsons became an integral part of Maplewood, their presence no longer seen as an intrusion, but as a valuable contribution to the community. The block party had been a turning point, and the ongoing efforts to foster dialogue, inclusivity, and understanding had reshaped the neighborhood in profound ways. Michael's role as both the police chief and an advocate for community unity became central to Maplewood's identity. He worked tirelessly with local organizations to create safe spaces for discussions on prejudice, race, and belonging, offering residents opportunities to express their concerns, ask questions, and learn from each other. Angela, with her background in education, spearheaded initiatives at the local school, ensuring that children from all backgrounds felt represented and included. Together, they created educational workshops that focused on celebrating diversity and breaking down stereotypes. The effects of these efforts were visible. Mrs. Thompson, once a symbol of the neighborhood's resistance to change, was now making sincere attempts to integrate herself into the new Maplewood. Her initial hesitation slowly faded as she became involved in community projects, learning more about the different cultures and perspectives that made the neighborhood thrive. She wasn't perfect. Old habits and biases sometimes resurfaced, but her willingness to change made a noticeable difference. One day, after attending one of the educational workshops on diversity that Angela had organized, Mrs. Thompson approached her, a little unsure but sincere. I never thought I'd be learning so much at my age, she said with a small smile. I used to think I had all the answers, but now I see there's still a lot to learn. Angela smiled warmly at her. We're all learning, Mrs. Thompson. What matters is that you're here and you're open to change. That's the most important thing. The two women shared a brief but meaningful moment, a silent acknowledgement of the journey they had been on since the day the Johnsons moved into the neighborhood. The sense of unity and mutual respect grew with each passing day. Neighbors who had once been distant or indifferent to each other started to look out for one another. Barbecues, block parties, and neighborhood cleanups became regular occurrences, with people of all ages and backgrounds participating. The Johnsons were no longer seen as outsiders. They were the heart of the community, bridging gaps and bringing people together. 1 year after the initial barbecue, the Johnsons hosted another gathering. This time, there were no police interruptions, no whispered doubts, and no tensions. Instead, the air was filled with laughter, the scent of diverse foods from various cultures, and a genuine sense of belonging. Mrs. Thompson even contributed her famous apple pie, which became a highlight of the event. As Michael stood by the grill, watching the children, including Jasmine and Kevin, play in the yard, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The road had been long and difficult, but the change they had hoped for had finally taken root. The neighborhood that had once seemed closed off and resistant had transformed into a community of openness, respect, and understanding. Angela, standing beside him, looked out over the crowd. "We did it," she said softly, her voice filled with pride and joy. "We really did it." Michael smiled, pulling her close. "We did," he agreed. "But more than that, we all did it. This isn't just about us. It's about the whole neighborhood coming together." As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the yard, the Johnsons knew that they had not only found a place to live but a true home. They had helped build a community that embraced differences, celebrated diversity, and worked through its challenges together. And in the end, that was the greatest victory of all. The Harvest Festival marked a turning point for the entire neighborhood. What had started as a community garden, an effort to build something beautiful and inclusive, had grown into a symbol of unity, transformation, and the power of collaboration. The festival was not just about showcasing the vegetables and flowers that had been grown. It was about celebrating the bonds that had formed and the healing that had taken place in Maplewood. On the day of the festival, the neighborhood buzzed with excitement. The park where the garden had been planted was decorated with colorful banners, and booths were set up showcasing the harvest. Tables were laden with fresh vegetables, homemade jams, and preserves, all produced by the neighbors. Local vendors joined in, offering baked goods and crafts, adding to the festive atmosphere. Music filled the air, and the children played in a designated area, proudly showing off the mini gardens they had helped cultivate. Michael and Angela walked through the park, greeting neighbors and marveling at the transformation their community had undergone. It was hard to believe that just months earlier, tensions had run high and misunderstandings had divided the neighborhood. Now, those divisions seemed like a distant memory. As they approached the center of the garden, they spotted Mrs. Thompson at one of the booths, smiling as she offered samples of her homemade apple pie. She had become a regular contributor to neighborhood events and was now a part of the community in a way that even she might not have imagined before. Her transformation had been one of the most significant outcomes of the Johnsons' efforts, and seeing her actively participating, building friendships, and contributing to the garden was a reminder of how far they had all come. "Your pie smells amazing, Mrs. Thompson," Angela said with a smile as she approached the booth. Mrs. Thompson looked up and beamed, a genuine warmth in her expression. "Thank you, Angela. It's my grandmother's recipe. I wasn't sure if anyone would like it, but it seems to be a hit." "It always is," Michael chimed in, grabbing a slice. "I think people look forward to it at every event now." Mrs. Thompson chuckled, clearly pleased. "Well, I'm just happy to be a part of all this. The garden, the festival, it's more than I ever thought it would be." Angela nodded. "It's really brought us all together, hasn't it?" "Yes, it has," Mrs. Thompson agreed, her voice softening. "I never imagined I'd feel so connected again. This garden, this community, it's given me something I didn't even realize I was missing." As the festival continued, the entire neighborhood came together in celebration. There were food tastings, gardening workshops, and even a small contest for the best homegrown vegetable. Children ran around laughing, families gathered at picnic tables, and neighbors shared stories of how the garden had enriched their lives. The sense of camaraderie and unity was palpable. People who had once been strangers or distant neighbors were now working side by side, connected by their shared efforts to grow something meaningful. When the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the garden, Michael and Angela gathered everyone together for a short speech. Standing in front of the lush rows of vegetables and flowers, Michael addressed the crowd. "Thank you all for being here today," he began, his voice filled with gratitude. "This garden is more than just a place to grow food. It's a symbol of what we can achieve when we come together, when we listen to each other, and when we work to build something that benefits everyone. We've been through a lot as a community, but today shows that we're stronger because of it." Angela added, "We couldn't have done this without all of you. Each of you has contributed in some way, whether by planting a seed, sharing your knowledge, or just showing up to support each other. This is what community looks like." The crowd applauded, and for a moment, there was a shared sense of pride and accomplishment that filled the air. The garden had become a living testament to their collective effort, a place where differences were set aside, and where people could come together to nurture both the land and their relationships. As the festival wound down, the Johnsons stood back, watching as neighbors packed up their booze and families began to head home. The garden, illuminated by soft lights, stood as a quiet reminder of what could be achieved when people worked together. "We really did it," Angela said, leaning into Michael as they looked out over the garden. Michael nodded, his heart full. "Yeah, we did, and it's just the beginning." In the months and years to come, the community garden would continue to thrive, becoming a permanent fixture in Maplewood and a place where people gathered to not only grow food, but to grow closer as neighbors and friends. The Johnsons' journey, which had begun with uncertainty and resistance, had evolved into a story of resilience, unity, and hope. A reminder that when people come together with open hearts and minds, there's no limit to what they can achieve. Michael and Angela's story serves as a powerful example of the impact that resilience, compassion, and community engagement can have on transforming a difficult situation into something beautiful and lasting. Faced with unexpected hostility from Mrs. Thompson and the prejudices that lingered within their neighborhood, they chose to respond with grace, unity, and a steadfast commitment to bringing people together. Their decision to create opportunities for dialogue and collaboration, such as the community garden and the harvest festival, not only helped heal old wounds, but also fostered a sense of belonging and inclusivity that would endure for generations. Their journey was not easy. It required patience, empathy, and the strength to keep moving forward despite setbacks. But by focusing on what united them, rather than what divided them, they were able to transform their neighborhood into a place where diversity was celebrated and every resident had a voice. If I were in Michael and Angela's position, I would hope to have the courage to respond with the same level of grace and perseverance. Their ability to see beyond the hostility and recognize the potential for growth and understanding is truly inspiring. Choosing to meet conflict with unity rather than further division is often the harder path, but their story reminds us that it can lead to lasting and meaningful change. If you enjoyed this story of community resilience and reconciliation, please consider subscribing to my channel. I put a lot of effort into creating these impactful narratives, and your support truly means the world to me. Thank you for being a part of this journey, and together, let's continue to sow the seeds of change.